Okay, we just wait. Oh no, it's actually time now. So, hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Hello Nora. Okay, so Hina is got her PhD from Cambridge University on it was on Iqbal and Tagore. What was the exact title of your thesis?
Yeah, so it was called Becoming Words of Witness, the theme of co-creation in Muhammad Iqbal and Rabindranath Tagore.
Okay, great. And do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your interest in Iqbal and Tagore?
Yeah, sure. So Assalamu alaikum everyone. Really nice to be with you all. So as Rabia said, I've just completed my PhD on Iqbal and Tagore. And more broadly, I'm interested in kind of Hindu-Muslim relations through art and poetry and philosophy. So how that's developed in the subcontinent and how it kind of continues in different forms today. And I sort of landed on Iqbal and Tagore as really interesting figures because obviously they were living at a similar time, contending with similar questions and pressures, both socio-political and kind of religious as well. So yeah, I just thought the kind of dialogue between them would yield some interesting insights.
Great. Alhamdulillah. It seems like an interesting comparison. So do you want to go straight in and start with your talk?
Sure.
Then?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you again, Rabia, for this opportunity and to you all for joining today. So in today's talk, I want to offer some comparative reflections on what I've called the logic of love in the writings of two major philosopher-poets of the Indian subcontinent, Muhammad Iqbal and Rabindranath Tagore. So I'll begin by exploring their theologies, so their foundational understandings of the divine. And then I'll look at their anthropologies, so the basic conception of the human person that flows from their theologies. For both poets, as we'll see, the finite world stands as a shimmering sign or window into the inexhaustible divine reality. And within their cosmic visions, God and the human being are dynamically related in bonds of love. And I'll look especially at how they understand the artist or the figure of the artist within this sort of grand cosmic vision. For both of these poets, art or poetry enables us to see the divine light and hear the divine call anew. So by analyzing this logic of love in their writings, I want to suggest that Hindu-Muslim comparative work can yield a much richer theological harvest than may be initially expected. So beginning then with a brief background to both figures. Muhammad Iqbal was born in 1877 in Sialkot, Punjab, and died in 1938, and is regarded today as the, quote, spiritual father of the modern nation state of Pakistan, although he died 9 years before the state's inception. His work spans the realms of philosophy, poetry, and politics, his poetry written in Persian and Urdu, and his main philosophical work in English. And he sought through his multi-dimensional work to call Muslims to, as well as sketch the outlines of, a rejuvenated Muslim faith, one which he saw as dynamic in nature, oriented to social change, and which resisted what he called the idolatries of nationalism, social hierarchies, monarchical prestige, and so on. And much of his poetry tapped into the political alienation and cultural subjugation that many Indian Muslims felt under colonial rule. And the kind of lament of Muslim decline remained a constant theme of his verses. Rabindranath Tagore, our other interlocutor for today, is perhaps the most famous Bengali poet of our age, whose tender verses continue to resound through the breezes of Bengal's villages. He was born in 1861 to a prestigious family of artists and died in 1941 at the ripe age of 80. Primarily celebrated as a poet who became popular in the West after his securing of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, he was the first non-European to do so. Tagore was also a philosophical thinker, a playwright, an author of short stories, and even a painter towards the end of his life. He authored the national anthems of India and Bangladesh, though himself an avid critic of what he called the, quote, fetish of nationalism. An important lifelong concern of Tagore's was the relationship between East and West. More specifically, how the particularities of one's own spiritual and cultural tradition could be preserved while sustaining an intellectual openness and hospitality to the socio-religious other. In this vein, he established a small school in a rural corner of Bengal in 1901, inspired by the ideals of the traditional Indian ashram. And later in 1921, he established a larger university in the same locality, which he envisioned as an abode of peace where, quote, the whole world might meet in a single nest. So with this image of a nest in mind, let's turn first to Iqbal's metaphysics, wherein the finite, is intimately nestled in and reflective of the infinite. More specifically, for Iqbal, the universe is fundamentally dynamic and reflects God in new ways at every moment. In presenting this vision of a creatio continua, Iqbal develops a kind of interplay between certain Quranic imageries, Western philosophical concepts, and discoveries of contemporary science. By drawing on these multiple resources, Iqbal develops his notion of the universe as the ongoing self-manifestation of God, in which all finite entities variously embody the divine plenitude. So, commenting on the Quran's description of the divine as, quote, peerless and unique, Iqbal develops his account of God as the, quote, great I am, or the ultimate ego here just denoting self, in whom the perfection of individuality is transcendently complete. In other words, God alone is the true self or individual, in the sense that God is non-dividual, i.e. not internally divided. God has no parts, as it were. Inasmuch as the universe is the, quote, self-revelation of the great I am of God, all created entities partake in this individuality according to their distinctive mode of being. So drawing on the cosmological vision of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, Iqbal argues that the universe is structured by these fine-grained gradations of selfhood, such that all things manifest individuality to the degree to which they can utter I am. Each thing in the universe is, in other words, a distinct khudi, a self, which is a Persian and Urdu term, which is a key theme in Iqbal's poetry. So that the universe is a kind of great chain of khudi, of distinct individual selves. The world is therefore not a passive or mute backdrop against which the human drama takes place, because every entity, every self is infused with a vitality and purpose of its own. The creaturely chorus of divine praise requires the unique contribution of each of its members. And Iqbal is, of course, drawing here on the Quranic idea of the world as a melodious constellation of the divine signs. Indeed, Iqbal writes, referring to two Quranic verses, that, quote, the Muslim's duty is to reflect on these signs and not to pass by them as if he is deaf and blind. For he who does not see these signs in this life will remain blind to the realities of the life to come, end quote. In a lovely Urdu verse, Iqbal writes that every finite thing possesses its own beauty, which furnishes a glimpse of the eternal divine beauty. So this creaturely vitality is, for Iqbal, a finite reflection of God's own life, and ultimately of God's longing to disclose himself to creation, a longing expressed in the sacred utterance of God, the Hadith Qudsi, I was a hidden treasure, and I longed or loved to be known, so I created the world. And of course, the meanings and mysteries of this phrase have been explored by Muslim poets over the ages. Rendering this divine yearning in his own creative idiom, Iqbal refers to the heart of God as writhing in the pain of solitude, and the creation of the world as the satisfaction of this longing. Just as God yearned to reveal God's self in and through the world, every existent, every creature also longs to unfold its inner potentialities. With the quote, "Zauq in namud," which is a Persian phrase Iqbal uses, meaning the taste or the delight of self-manifestation that permeates created realities. And so Iqbal poeticizes the first day of creation, on which all creatures declared in mutual joy, quote, "I am one thing, you are another." In truth, however, this creative process is not temporally tethered to a first day. Thus, Iqbal speaks of the universe as dynamically unfinished, for the divine creative call be, in Arabic kun, still runs through it at all levels. And this idea of the constant divine creativity is reflected for Iqbal in the Quran, Surah 55, verse 29, which articulates, quote, "the infinite reality who every moment appears in a new glory." So when outlining the nature of this dynamic universe, Iqbal crucially elaborates a kind of evolutionary scheme wherein all creatures distinctively, differently manifest the divine plenitude. And for Iqbal, it's in the human person alone and ultimately that this progressive continuum reaches its true fulfillment. So he says that self-awareness, selfhood has reached its, quote, relative perfection in human beings. And so human beings stand closest to the divine. For it's human beings alone who can consciously participate, his words, in God's creative life. And Iqbal links this notion of the unique creative power of the human being to some crucial Quranic motifs, most centrally the elaboration of the human being as the vicegerent, the Khalifa of God, and the granting of the divine trust, the amana, to human beings alone. This entrustment denotes for Iqbal the bestowal of a creative personality, which, as asserted in the Quran, the heavens, the earth, and the mountains refused to bear. Setting forth, therefore, a collaborative relation between the divine and the human forms of making, Iqbal addresses God in this way. You created night, and I created the lamp. You created clay, and I created the cup. You created deserts and mountains and forests. I created orchards, gardens, and groves. As vicegerent, the human being bears the creative power to go on from and perfect God's handiwork. The lamp befits the darkness of the night, and from clay is molded the practicable vessel. There is thus, or should be, a sort of cosmic correspondence between the divine and human creativity. We fulfill the amana, the trust, when our creative pursuits are rooted not in our subjectivist desires, but are reflective of the divine will. So if the human person and the human being's creativity is the fulfillment of the evolutionary order, the divine vicegerent, the Khalifa, is in turn the fulfillment or telos of humankind. In Iqbal's words, the Khalifa is the, quote, completest ego, the goal of humanity. Iqbal's conception of this realized, this fulfilled individual draws upon the Sufi notion of the perfect human, al-insan al-kamil. And in keeping with classical Islamic formulations of the perfect human, the archetype of the self-realized and God-attuned individual is, for Iqbal, the Prophet Muhammad himself, in whom human perfections and virtues attain their fullest expression. Indeed, Iqbal's description of the figure of the vicegerent bears an explicitly prophetic character. The vicegerent, we are told, infuses the created order with new purpose and vitality and awakens the spiritually dead to new life. The nature of the vicegerent longs for manifestation, for it abounds with creative possibilities. Most tellingly, Iqbal asserts that the vicegerent is the secret of the Quranic verse, "Glory to him who transported his servant by night." This verse, of course, alludes to the famous night journey, the Miraj of the Prophet, wherein, in Iqbal's words, the Prophet, quote, "beheld the divine essence without veils." Crucially, for Iqbal, the motor or metabolism of this prophetic witnessing is the force of ishq, of passionate creative love. If the Prophet was the archetypal Khalifa, vicegerent, it is because he was the perfect ashik, the perfect lover of God. And in Iqbal's work, as I've understood it, ishq possesses two interrelated meanings. Firstly, it is that light in the human heart that enables one to know God, to love God, and to rise to God in an imitation of the Prophet's night journey. And note here that it's specifically the human heart that Iqbal, as other Sufi poets before him, identify as the spiritual organ of mystical knowledge. The template for this, again, being the Prophet. We recall that the Quran was revealed not to the mind of the Prophet, but to his heart. And the Prophet, during his ascension, witnessed the highest truth, again, with his heart. For Iqbal, the Miraj, this I-thou encounter of love, represents the fulfillment of human selfhood, wherein the Prophet transcended time and space and gazed upon God without himself becoming annihilated. So this brings us to our second meaning of ishq. If ishq is a light by which one sees the divine, it is also a fire with which one fortifies, one strengthens oneself, or khudi. For it ignites the, quote, creation of values and ideals and the endeavor to realize them. More specifically, Iqbal says the values and ideals by which the human person's khudi, selfhood, is fortified are the divine attributes, following, of course, the prophetic injunction to qualify yourself with the qualities of God. Ishq denotes that dynamism of desire which propels the individual to cultivate and embody these divine qualities. And yet, this pursuit of progressive similitude to God, this taking on of God's qualities, which is, of course, perfected by the figure of the Khalifa, coexists in Iqbal's work with the crucial language of fakiri, of spiritual poverty, such that Iqbal gestures towards a kind of conceptual equivalence between the ideals of the Khalifa, fakir, and ashik. In other words, these are in many ways synonymous for Iqbal. So the vicegerent's assimilation of the divine qualities, which is catalyzed by ishq, is concurrent with their realization of God's utter transcendence and self-sufficiency, and thus of their own ontological poverty in relation to the eternally rich God, as the Quran puts it. Ishq is that cosmic current, then, that unites strength and submission. Indeed, to return to Iqbal's beloved theme of the Miraj, at the summit of his proximity to God, the Prophet was famously designated Abduhu, God's servant, a state which signifies not servile subjection, but a self-stabilizing surrender to the divine. So this interplay of strength and submission is focalized in Iqbal's description of the figure of the artist, who stands, much like the Khalifa, as co-creator with God. In Iqbal's worldview, as we may expect, the luminous fire of love, of ishq, constitutes the heartbeat of true art. If the lover, in an imitation of the Prophet's night journey, enjoys this immediate heart witnessing of God, so too is art rooted in an intuitive realization of truth. Indeed, Iqbal draws a direct connection between the vocations of poetry and prophecy. In his Urdu poem Shamma or Shair, The Candle and the Poet, Iqbal writes that poetry is a portion or part of prophecy. And elsewhere, Iqbal writes that if poetry is oriented to the fortification of human beings, it becomes the inheritor of prophecy. This idea of poetry as reflecting something of prophecy is developed especially by Iqbal's imagery of the prophet Moses, whose vision of God on Mount Sinai comes to represent the poet's own spiritual insight. So in a lexical interplay of the words sina, sina meaning breast or chest in Urdu and Persian, and metaphorically meaning the heart, and Sinai, so developing an interplay of these two terms, Iqbal writes that the theophany, the divine unveiling on Mount Sinai, unfolds at each moment within the poet's heart, within the poet's sina. And crucially, where art flows from this abundance of ishq, it awakens the vitality of love in others too. So Iqbal writes that the poet's entire nature is desire, is longing, and he is also the creator and nurturer of longing in others. Returning to Iqbal's Candle and Poet poem, the candle therefore declares to the poet that whilst it burns because it has to, because of the requirements of its nature, the poet burns to make others burn with him. So through this communion with the divine and this creative call unto others, the poet is the, quote, heart, the dil, inside the chest of the nation. Indeed, the nation without a poet, Iqbal affirms, is like a mere heap of clay, shorn of the beating heart of desire. In a beautiful image, Iqbal writes that the worship, the ibadat of the poet's eye, is that it remains in ablution at each moment, drawing here on the Sufi poetic image of the lover's tears as her ablution. And tying together again the motif of the mirage with the impulse of ishq, Iqbal elsewhere notes that these prayerful tears cleanse the sight so that the lover might behold the beloved. He says, to purify my vision of you, God, I immerse my yearning sight in a stream of tears. So, having elaborated Iqbal's cosmic picture and the role of the artist in sort of perfecting this picture, let's turn now to Tagore. So in developing his cosmology, Tagore creatively interweaves a range of pre-modern Hindu scriptural ideas and theological concepts. But at the heart of Tagore's cosmology is the idea that the world is sung into being, where this sonic impulse is not a kind of one-time burst of divine activity, but pulsates through the cosmos continuously. And for Tagore, this sort of cosmic power, this cosmic resonance of sound is reflected in the sacred syllable Om, which is understood within some Hindu cosmologies as the primordial divine sound or divine call. The meaning of Om, Tagore tells us, is God's cosmic yes to the world, by which God utters and sustains all things in being. This Om, or this divine call, possesses a capaciousness that reflects its transcendent origin. The Om encompasses all things, because God too encompasses all seemingly opposed realities within his being. So reflecting some sort of paradoxical verses from the Upanishads, Upanishads representing some of the foundational texts of Hindu philosophy, Tagore writes that God moves and yet is still. He is distant and yet near. He is within, yet also without. Thus, quote, he does not leave out anyone. That is why he is verily Om. So Tagore goes on to characterize the divine with the Upanishadic formulation of Santam Shivam Advaitam, peace, bliss, and non-duality. And Tagore notes then that God's peace does not imply a kind of utter lack of motion. Instead, stillness, peace, and movement are harmoniously intertwined in the divine reality. So this idea, this vision of a world infused with and flowing from sacred sound is most vividly developed in Tagore's poetic images of the world as the song or music of the divine being. The world is woven on the warp and weft of a stream of notes, each of which reveals, to use Tagore's characteristic idea, the cosmic harmony of the finite and the infinite. Unlike other forms of art in which the final artwork takes on an independent existence, once a painting, for instance, is completed, the painter's loving strokes are withdrawn. The streams of song that burst forth from the singer are never separable from their creative origin. So the world song is unceasingly renewed with each divine exhalation and ever newly reflects the divine singer. And this notion of creation as God's spontaneous song points us to the crucial Hindu idiom, the Hindu idea of Leela. So Leela is a kind of a rich, polyvalent Sanskrit term encompassing meanings such as sport, play, charm, beauty, and others. But in essence, it refers across Hindu cosmologies to the idea that God is a free artist who produces and sustains the world through a kind of spontaneous overflow of the divine joy or the divine bliss. In other words, God's creativity is not necessitated by any external imperative acting upon God, because this would imply a lack or a need in God that the world somehow fulfills. And Tagore is echoing these templates of Leela when he says, quote, God's creation has not its source in any necessity. It comes from his fullness of joy. It is his love that creates. Therefore, in creation is his own revealment. So as a cosmic symphony that God freely sings, creation streams out of and continuously reveals the divine abundance. Somewhat paradoxically, Tagore presents this joyful unfolding, this joyful self-revelation, as God's renunciation or God's sacrifice of himself in and to the finite. And these seemingly opposed idioms of abundance on the one hand and renunciation find their synthesis for Tagore in the force of love. So elaborating the nature of God's creative love in Bengali Prem, Tagore affirms that the plenitude of love is inseparably intertwined with the austerity of sacrifice. Without love, there is no true sacrifice, just as without sacrifice, there is no true love. If one's act of giving away something is impelled by fear or by need, that is no sacrifice at all. Only that which we give from the fullness of our love is a true sacrifice. Since God is the essence or true form of love, God is also the eternal sacrificer. Indeed, it is precisely because God is unconstrained by need that God is continually active and is, quote, giving himself to the world. So in the divine life, to give is to be, so that renunciation is abundance. And this dynamic of self-recovery through self-negation represents the paradigm for our own creative movement through the world. In other words, the Tagorean maxim seems to be, I give, therefore I am. So for Tagore, God is perpetually renouncing giving himself in and to the world in this cosmic Leela, this play. And it is in and through the freedom of the human personality that this cosmic gift becomes known and is responded to as gift. Indeed, that this finite world is a gift is realized only by the human being, the personal self of the human being, who is capable of receiving the world as such, of receiving the world as gift. Because the gift, Tagore says, is no quantifiable transaction but is the abundant, non-necessitated offering of love, made by the, quote, soul unto the soul. From the heart of creation, therefore, arises a love call, Tagore calls it, ceaselessly articulated by the world. And it asks the human person, quote, friend, have you seen me? Do you love me? Not as one who provides you with foods and fruit, not as one whose laws you have found out, but as one who is personal, individual. So the gift of God that is the world presents itself to us as a call, and without a loving response to this call, the gift would remain unrealized. And love for Tagore bears the character of a response precisely because a response is only truly a response if it is freely offered. And love is paradigmatically that which cannot be compelled. The human world relation therefore reveals itself as a perpetually spiraling circuit of self-giving. The world, which is God's continuous self-renunciation, gives itself to us, and we are called to give our love to it. One of the most enchanting notes of the world's love call for Tagore is that of beauty, which silently streams through the spring flowers and the serene night sky. Tagore presents the beauty of the world as a constantly streaming song, and strikingly as God's own prayer, through which God seeks to incite our love. In one address or discourse, Tagore writes that the beauty of the world tenderly, tearfully awaits the human person's recognition. The beauty that suffuses the flowers is God's own, quote, love letter to us, which, however, we have not yet read. As a result, the blissful meeting remains unrealized, and God's prayer remains unheeded. God could have, Tagore says, set forth a kind of regal display of the divine power, which would compel us to turn to him. But instead, he seeks to gently charm us through the innumerable beauties of the world. Our loving attentiveness to beauty is therefore entirely free, but a freedom to which we are, in a higher sense, bound. For it's only in our free submission to beauty's call that we inhabit the infinite truth of human life and come to know that this existence is, in fact, in Tagore's words, a birth of joy. It is supremely the artist who heeds God's prayer, who responds to this call of beauty. So Tagore presents art, or the creative, the aesthetic impulse, as a joyful meeting of the divine and the human, which recapitulates in and through time the love-infused Leela of the divine. So just like God's cosmic Leela is not necessitated by anything outside of God, we also create art not as a means to an end, but for spontaneously, joyfully delighting in the beauty of the world. So in art, Tagore says, we reveal the, quote, wealth of our inner life. And in doing so, we reflect the God who, quote, takes joy in productions that are unnecessary to him. So the artist utters in response to the world's call, quote, yes, I have seen you, I have loved and known you, not that I have any need of you, not that I have taken you and used your laws for my own purposes of power. I see you where you are what I am. Ordinarily, Tagore notes, we do not give to the world of our true creative wealth, our true creative abundance, because the world is dimmed for us under the veil of utility. Like the passenger on the train who is aware of the outside world, but for whom the immediate carriage and the journey is more real, we typically only see the things that serve some need for us. Much of our world, therefore, quote, passes by us like a caravan of shadows. In creating art, however, we lift the blinkers that ordinarily structure our seeing of reality and which divert our gaze from the transcendent truth of things. It is not only, therefore, that the artist sees more, i.e., the world beyond the carriage, but that she also sees more deeply the carriage in its full spiritual radiance. Much like a child who, Tagore writes, does not know its mother's name or any other facts about her, but knows her truly in its intimate love for her. Endowed with this vision into the plenitude of finite reality, the artist sees more truly. And this is, in short, because the artist sees through the lens of love. To see through love is not to veer away from truth, but to enter more fully into it. In Tagore's words, love, quote, radiantly reveals the reality of its objects. This attentive attunement, this loving gaze directed towards the truth of things, marks crucially not a feat of mastery, as though the artist has kind of fully domesticated the object within her imaginative view, but heralds rather an opening into mystery, where the object, and thus the artwork that bears witness to it, tantalizingly resists final capture or control. So, commenting on a poem particularly beloved to him, Tagore states, the poem, has its grammar, its vocabulary, but when we divide them part by part and try to torture out a confession from them, the poem, which is one, departs like the gentle wind, silently, invisibly. No one knows how it exceeds all its parts, transcends all its laws, and communicates with the person. The significance which is in unity is an eternal wonder. In Tagore's vocabulary, this ungraspable unity refers to the Atman, which is the Sanskrit term for the immutable spiritual self which abides within and yet transcends all individual beings. Tagore defines the Atman as that, quote, inner perfection that permeates and exceeds all its contents, much like the beauty in a lotus, which is ineffably more than all the constituents of the flower. In other words, the lotus's beauty unifies and illuminates its individual parts, but is not itself one part among those parts. For Tagore, then, the finite world is constantly brimming over with the infinite, and art constitutes a gentle greeting, a calling towards the gift of divine love. So, to conclude, for both Iqbal and Tagore, artistic creativity provides one site, one locus, which embodies the divine human relationality, through which we recapitulate, reflect, and respond to God's continuous giving of himself to creation. For Iqbal, human love, ishq, stands as the attribute most fully imitating God, who first loved to be known or yearned to unfold the plenitude of his creative being. For Tagore, too, part of realizing the infinite in ourselves is to become like the cosmic singer, by reflecting in and through our worldly activities something of God's eternal self-giving bliss. In other words, for both of our poets, anthropology recapitulates and reenacts cosmology. What it means for humans to be human is, in some irreducible way, interwoven with what it means for God to be God. So if God's love, if God's ishq, God's brim, is the creative momentum of the cosmos, so too must our own iteration, must our own responses be dynamically love-infused. And for Iqbal and Tagore, as we've seen, the artist has supremely responded to the world's call by seeing and hearing that world in its true depth, and her art in turn articulates a call to others. And I'll just finish by saying that while these resonances between Iqbal and Tagore may seem quite remarkable, and remarkable they indeed are, they reflect some long-range thematic overlaps across the universes of Hindu devotion and Islamic mysticism. So I'll suggest in closing that the comparative study of these universes may generate more interreligious insight than we'd expect at first sight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful.